As I said to the people who are here at 9 o'clock this morning, it is so good for Diane and me to be back with you. This is just such a wonderful church, and we are grateful to be a part of the services. I have to tell you, the last several months, I've been kind of an itinerant minister going to different churches. And it's been very interesting. I thought about the praise team, how wonderfully they did. I'm not going to name the church, but Diane and I got to this church. We had never been there before. We got there a little early. The praise team was rehearsing. Diane and I were sitting there talking to a little girl who was a part of the church. And all of a sudden, I heard a lot of screaming and yelling from the praise team. They were yelling and screaming at each other. Well, they don't know who I am. So I went over to them and I said, "Is there a problem?" And they said, "No." Well, obviously there was a problem. And I said, "Well, if we don't get this act together in a few minutes, we're really going to have difficulty when we get out there screaming at each other." So how grateful I am for a praise team that doesn't scream at each other, at least in the worship service. I don't know about rehearsals. They may do that, but not in the worship service. It was 2007. My phone rang. The man on the other side said, "My name is Jim." He said, "I'm the chair of the transition committee at the First Baptist Church of El Paso, Texas." Jim said, "We would like for you to come one Sunday to preach during this time of interim." I wanted to say to Jim, there are a lot of preachers in Texas. But Jim insisted that I come, and I was glad I did. I checked into the hotel. Linda and Jim picked me up. We went out to dinner. Linda and Jim both said, "We are so proud of the city in which we live." White faces, brown faces, black faces, but we all have a wonderful way of getting along with each other. We have learned how to take diversity and make it something good. I thought about that this morning because I thought, and I don't know who the pastor of First Baptist El Paso is, but as he stands to preach to his congregation this morning, can you imagine what you would say in a situation like that? Do you know, I find that my heart is broken, that I feel like weeping in the midst of all of the things that are happening around us. I feel like Jeremiah, because Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet. You've met some people. You can say anything to them, and it doesn't bother them. You meet other people who are very sensitive, and you can say something to them, and it cuts like a knife through their lives. Jeremiah was that kind of person. He was sensitive. He was a sensitive prophet. God said to him one day, he said, "Jeremiah, I have something for you to do. I want you to go to my people, Israel, and I want you to tell them to come back to me." What a message. Jeremiah, my people who used to be so close to me, who used to feel my presence, now living simply on the memories of when things were so good. Jeremiah, it is your task to stand up and say to the people, I want you to come back to God. For 40 years, Jeremiah pleaded with the people. Will you come back to God? Will you come back to know the power of His presence? Will you come back in that kind of relationship, as the early part of Jeremiah describes, like a bride, following the groom into the desert, not knowing where they're going? Like the enthusiasm of the youth who follow Christ. Jeremiah, that's what I want you to do. For 40 years, preaching, prophesying. I don't know whether they gave an invitation, but if they did, can you imagine for 40 years, you are the pastor of the church. Every Sunday you get up and you say basically the same thing. I want you to come to know God. I want you to come back to God. Some of you who've moved away from God still have kind of a relationship with God, but not the kind that you used to have. Come back to God. And when He gave the invitation, nobody came. 40 years. Jeremiah finally said, God, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep speaking these words to people and nobody seems to have ears to hear. God, you've got to find somebody else to do this because it is taking so much out of me to try to say to people, will you come back to God? And ears are closed. And eyes are closed. And nobody moves. Jeremiah, God said, I believe it's time for you to hear a sermon. That's not bad advice for those of us who are preachers. We do a lot of speaking. I preached my first sermon when I was 15 years old. I need to go back to those people and apologize. I don't even know what I said. There are a lot of people I need to go back to apologize for some preaching that I did. But over 60 years ago, I stood in the Miami Rescue Mission and preached to people who had come off the streets, falling on the floor. They'd come for a sandwich and for soup, and they didn't know they had to listen to me preach. There's no way for me to tell you how underwhelmed they were by that. They wanted the bed and the sandwich and the soup, not the sermon. And there I was, with people falling out of the pews, trying to keep going to say something. Jeremiah, I want you to go to the potter's house. And I want you to see a sermon. Not so much hear a sermon. I want you to see something that is going on with the potter, and I want you to see how I can work in your life. So Jeremiah went to the potter's house. God said, are you looking, Jeremiah? Are you looking at the potter? Because what I want you to see is that the potter always has the clay in his hands. The clay, your life and my life. the potter God. The message to Jeremiah and to Chuck and to every one of us this morning is that regardless of what you and I are facing in our lives, God always has us in God's hands. Jeremiah, don't forget, it's not about you. It is about the God who holds you. When I was a pastor, we would have vacation Bible school every year. And the first few years, I did terrible things in vacation Bible school. I would announce to the teacher that I was going to come in at 11:45 and be with the class. Do you know what happened at 11:45? The children were having fun. They were on the floor. They were finger painting. They were doing all the things they really like to do. And then I would walk into the room, and I don't know where the teacher would get this kind of voice, but she would say, "The preacher is here." You could just feel the fun hit the floor and break apart. Pulling those little chairs into a circle, and I sat there with the children. And I didn't know what to say to them. They were having fun. They didn't want me there. And so I decided what I would do is I would not let the teacher know I was coming. I went one day, standing outside a room. The children were singing. I didn't want to interrupt. They were singing a song that I'd heard many times before, but that day, the song from those children penetrated the very heart of who I am. God is so high, you can't get over him. God is so low, you can't get under him. God is so wide, you can't get around him. I went to my office, sat down, and said to myself, that is the very thing that people need in the church. Sitting in the back row of the church, I knew some of their stories. He'd come home from a business trip. She took out the shirts. She knew the perfume smell wasn't hers. 30 years they'd been married. And now it was fractured. Looking at me, do you have any word from God? An older woman on the third row, she always pulled her shawl around herself, whether it was summer or winter. I knew that week she had been to the doctor. The doctor said, "I'm sorry to have to tell you, the diagnosis is not good." Looking at me, do you have any word from God? Do you have any word that there is a God that is big enough and wide enough and low enough and strong enough? Do you have anything to say to me about a God whom I can trust? In the balcony of a church, 15-year-old girl, so attractive. But I also knew that drugs, just something that she played with at the corners of her life for a while, but now they had captured the very center of who she was, and she was looking at me. And I'm speaking. Do you have any words from God? Jeremiah, don't ever forget. It doesn't matter people's response. That depends on God, not you, Jeremiah. You simply be faithful to the message and remember God holds you in His hands. Are you listening, Jeremiah? Because I want you to see that the clay that the potter God works with is flawed clay. Have you ever said to yourself, I'm going to pull myself up, rather than saying, I'm going to let God pull me up? There are some of us who are trying to get our act together before we come to God, to try to get the clay of our lives in the shape that we want it to be before we come and put our lives in the potter's hands. But flawed clay. Do you know, I remember when I was going to be a perfect pastor. It all ended in my first country church when I was a student pastor. Bill and Christina Smith, members of the church, married to each other, but they didn't sit together. Christina came down to the front. Bill sat in the very back row. He took his knee and he put it up against the pew in front of him, and he looked at me with those kind of steely eyes. Do you have anything that you're going to say to me today? So I decided to make a pastoral visit. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go by to get to know Bill, and then we'll be good friends. Big old house. Christina met me at the door, walked in. Pot-bellied stove to heat the house. Bill's in the back room, she said. I walked in the back room, and there was Bill, and do you know what he was doing? He was watching championship wrestling. Now, folks, I'm about to tell you, if I were to name the 5 worst mistakes that I've ever made as a minister, this would probably be right at the top. I looked at Bill. I don't know whether I was out of my mind. I looked at Bill, and I looked at that wrestling on television, and do you know what I said? Bill, you know that's not real, don't you? So, friends, if you've got a picture of Hulk Hogan in your room, I'm with you. I said to myself, I've done something a pastor should never do. I didn't take seriously something Bill took very seriously. A few weeks later, Bill, who didn't say much, brought Diane and me some strawberries and some lettuce and tomato out of his garden. Here it is. Bill, thanks. I made a big mistake, and I'm sorry. I was going to be a perfect husband until Diane and I got married. Not a week into the marriage, when we suddenly have, let's not say ministers have arguments, let's just say disagreements. We had a kind of a big disagreement over some curtains. I don't know anything about curtains. I don't know why I was arguing about curtains. I thought the marriage was over. I didn't think you had arguments after you got married. I thought it was all just sweet, everybody nice to each other. By the way, Diane and I would be married 52 years this December, so we made it through the curtains. If you want to argue about something big, pick out something like curtains. I was going to be a perfect father until our first child came. I remember telling Diane, I'm going to pull my weight. 3 o'clock in the morning, I'll be up. 3 o'clock in the morning, Laura Beth is in full cry. I'm elbowing Diane saying, your child is crying. How many times have we thought to ourselves, I'm going to be perfect. I'm going to get it right. I'm going to finally be what God wants me to be, and then I'll come to Christ. Jeremiah, watch what God can do. When somebody dares to put her life in God's hands, flawed clay. Jeremiah, I want you to hear this word. Did you notice it says that the potter shapes it seems as it seems best to him? I know that you're looking at the great commandment, love God with everything that you are, love neighbors as yourselves. But I want to say something. What I want to say is this. I'm all for the great commandment. But I know that none of us in our own weakness can do what God wants us to do. It is God who gives us the unconditional love. It is God who says, I want you to love me, and I'll give you the strength to do that. It's God who says, love your neighbors. Well, some of us don't even like our neighbors. How are we going to love them? We're going to love them because I'm going to give you the strength. Jeremiah, I know you're ready to give up. I know you want to throw in the towel and go home. But before you do, will you remember this? God always has us in God's hands. You and I have a time of response to what is said. Growing up Baptist, I think I've sung all the invitation hymns 1,000 times, each of the hymns. But I guess the one that I've sung the most and maybe means the most to me is the one that just says, just as I am. Not just as I want to be, just as I am, I come to you. So as we sing in just a moment, maybe you're here. You've never really said yes to Jesus in your life. You're sort of on the fence. You need to be a part of this church. In whatever way God calls. Heather is going to be here in the front. As we stand, I'm going to ask you to come. Let's stand together.